In this chapter, we are going to talk about blanket purchase order. What is a blanket purchase order? And why would you use a blanket purchase order? To understand this, let's say the Chicago headquarters has two plants. One in Chicago and another in San Francisco. Now, say the HQ or the headquarters plant needs some stationery, pens, papers, pencils, printer supplies, so on. Now, we don't want to mass produce stationery, right? Why? It's a waste of money. Instead, procure them when needed. We can afford to do this. We can't do this for coffee. Why? Because coffee is such an essential commodity. We can't open our shop without coffee. But stationery is basically low value, low priority item. So for materials like that, irrespective of the material, there is always a cost associated with the procure to pay cycle. Meaning, to get something, to buy something, you have to identify the vendor, have a relationship with the vendor, issue POs, you need a purchasing officer, somebody needs to receive the goods and then evaluate the goods, somebody in the office needs to take in the invoice, record it, find out how long it's due, pay it in time. This is the typical procure to pay cycle, right? Now, there is a cost associated with this cycle. It needs manpower, it needs documentation, it needs a process to be followed. For most materials, this process is okay. The overhead in this process is justifiable. Why? Because process makes sure that you get the goods in time. Coffee is made in time, coffee machine is there procured in time, the pastry is procured in time, everything is kept ready to go. But for some materials, for example, you want to do a birthday party in your coffee shop. You need balloons, party hats, straws. And for serving coffee, you need coffee cups. And for printing out stuff, you need stationery. Now, these are low value, non essential items. They're called Class C items. Why are they called Class C? Because they are low value and non essential. Coffee is essential. Party balloons are not essential, at least for this shop. So, for procuring Class C items or non essential items, you don't have to go through the entire purchasing cycle for every batch of products. Meaning, if you need 1000 coffee cups, you don't have to put a purchase order for that. What you can do instead is place one purchase order, right? For, let's say, each coffee cup is 10 cents or 5 cents, right? So 5 cents per cup, and you allocate a budget for coffee cups. Let's say every day your shop consumes, let's say, 1000 cups, right? So that's 1000 into 5 cents. That becomes $50, right? So you do the math and say there are 10 shops in Chicago and you end up with $500 worth of coffee cups. Multiply it by, let's say you want to keep stock for 15 days. 15, that becomes $7,500, right? So every 15 days or 2 weeks, you need to order $7,500 worth of coffee cups. Now, suppliers did not just supply coffee cups, right? They could supply all the other things that I was talking about. For example, a baking shop will supply coffee cups, will supply parchment paper, will supply most of these classy items that a bakery or coffee shop needs. So instead of saying, hey, you know what, I need 50 coffee cups, here is my order. I need 10 parchment papers, here is my order. Instead of that, what you can do is, you could say, hey vendor ABC, supplier of baking goods, here is my order for 20,000. All right? And these are all class C items, low value items. I'm not going to keep stock of them. Somebody in my coffee shop or my company is going to give you an order. Just deliver it to them. And as you deliver, keep sending me the invoice. And let's create a blanket purchase order and see how it's different from a typical purchase order. So vendor 4001, and instead of choosing a standard PO, choose framework order, FO. And when you choose FO, you have to select a different set of criteria. For example, you have to select a validity start and end date, meaning I've asked the vendor to supply $20,000 worth of goods, so that's an open amount, and you have to specify how long that offer or open amount is valid. For example, it's valid from today until, let's say, 2 months or 1 month. All right. And I'm not going to specify a material. Why? Because I'm not asking for a specific material, coffee cup or parchment paper. I'm saying I'm giving an order worth $20,000. It could be for any of these set of materials that you supply. So I'm going to give a blanket description, say consumables for coffee shop. That's going to include everything, all kinds of classy materials. Now remember, this does not include coffee or coffee machine or pastry. These are high value materials and these are essential materials. So you also want to keep track of that material in stock. So you don't want to use a framework order or a blanket purchase order for those kinds of materials. Example, coffee comes in, you need to store it in stock. At any given point in time, you have to know how much coffee you have at hand. But coffee cups, you don't care. Parchment paper, you don't care. So for materials like that, you don't have to store them in stock. And because you don't have to store them in stock, you could do a blanket PO. You just go by the value. We'll see how GR is different in this case. So please enter material number or account assignment category. That means that because it's a non-stock purchase order, meaning we're not going to stock the materials, you obviously need a cost center or some kind of account assignment. We have seen this when we were procuring non-stock materials. Remember? For stock materials, you don't need an account assignment, meaning when you put it in stock, it's accounted for. But for non-stock materials, you always need a cost center or some element that captures the cost. So in our case, we use cost center. Some cost centers say the admin department or one of the overhead departments eats the cost of consumables. All right. So we use account assignment K. An item category is not blank. It's not a standard purchase order, right? So what is it? Item category is B. Enter. And because we are not entering a material, framework order forces us to enter a material group. Basically, that's something that's used for reporting. Okay, so material group is say 015. Okay, and then it says please maintain services or limits. So we have created a framework order, but we didn't specify the amount. Remember, we said 20,000. That's our limit. So let's go specify the limit. Overall limit is 20,000, but in most cases that's the upper limit. Are we going to consume all the 20,000? Well, maybe not. Most of the cases we tend to consume only 10,000. All right, we could specify 10,000 there. And of course we need a cost center, right? In this case, let's use admin. All right. So the admin department is going to eat the cost of procuring $20,000 worth of consumables. Simple enough, right? Now, save it. All right, we got our framework order. All right, let's make a note of this purchase order. And now, what is the next step? We have created a framework order. Now, how is this going to be different from a standard purchase order? In a standard purchase order, when you procure coffee, when the vendor is ready, he's going to ship the coffee. And you're going to use MyGo to receive the goods and stock it, right? In case of a blanket PO, we've mentioned that it's a non-stock material. So we're not going to stock them, number one. And number two, when we are not going to stock them, we don't even need to do a MyGo. The vendor sends the invoice and you pay the vendor. It's as simple as that. You want to see an example? Myro. and the invoice date is today. And it's against a purchase order, right? So it's allowed posting periods, blah blah blah. We can go to MMPV and fix it. So I'm going to do that here, MMPV, or let me do it in MMPV. So the company code US01. Again, I could do this offline, but the point I'm trying to make here is you get these kinds of errors all the time. So be used to it. MMPV, close your posting periods. Now, here in one of the previous chapters, we have done negative stocks, right? And because of that, it says some materials have negative stocks in one of the previous periods, so I can't close the material posting period. What do you do for that? Allow negative quantities in the previous period, right? Click OK. So in cases like that, check this on. Allow negative quantities in the previous period. All right. And that closes the previous period. Now we are good to go. So Miro, we want to receive the invoice for, let's say the vendor has sent $1,000 worth of cups, and that's today, against this PO. Okay. Now here is what we need to enter. Go to account assignment and say the amount is for $1,000. Check and then back, right? And the amount here we got the invoice for is for $1,000, right? Let's remove this guy and make sure we are 0% tax here. All right. Now all the messages are gone. Let's see if we can save this. So what we have done here is create an invoice or receive the invoice that we got from the vendor for $1,000 against the purchase order. All right, the document has been posted. Now if you go back to the purchase order, what do you see here? Actual value of $1,000, meaning $1,000 has been consumed from an overall limit of 20,000. And as the vendor keeps sending those invoices, this value will keep accumulating until it hits the limit of 20,000, after which you really can't take in any more invoices. The services will be stopped and the vendor will ask you to raise another blanket PO. Okay, so what did we achieve here? Let's recap what we have done. So we said there are so many class C materials that we need to order every day, every week. These are non-essentials, not like coffee or pastry. Low value, non-essentials. And we said Instead of ordering these things every day, every week, it's a hassle. So we're gonna say, I'm gonna allocate a budget, a fixed budget, because I know it's gonna cost so much for the week or 2 weeks. And for that budget, $20,000, I could order anything that the vendor can supply. If the vendor supplies stationery, I like the price, I'll go for that. If the vendor supplies pens or pencils or papers, I'll go for that. If the vendor supplies cartridges or printer supplies, I'll go for that. All class C materials, right? And step number one, create a blanket PO. To create a blanket PO, the order type is FO, framework order. And the item category is B. And you always have to have an account assignment. Why? Simple. These are non-stock materials. You're not going to stock them. There's not going to be a MyGo. And you specify a limit, because this is of item category B, right? B means limit. And what is limit? You specify that the upper limit is 20,000, which means you're going to allocate a budget of 20,000, and the company can order anything, basically all class C materials, until the limit of 20,000 is reached. And of course, this gets shipped over to the vendor. The vendor looks at the PO, files it in his cabinet, and anytime you want something, you can just call the vendor, and the vendor will just ship them over, right? Basically, the goods, and you don't have to do a MyGo. Small supplies, right? Why waste your time or inventory management? No MyGo. Then he'll send an invoice, and that you file. So you go do a Miro invoice receipt, and over there you specify the amount and some text that identifies what has been supplied, some marker, that you can remember later. And the amount that has been invoiced will automatically be adjusted or marked in the limit of the purchase order. So the purchase order history will be updated saying, hey, you have consumed $1,000 out of your 20,000. This is the process of a blanket purchase order. So let's compare this with a standard purchase order. In a standard purchase order, so if you were to do the procurement of these small consumables using the standard PO method, what would you do? Anytime you're out of supplies, or you're going to be out of supply in a couple of days or weeks, you create a PO. It could be against a cost center, or it could be not against a cost center if you want to show your stock. And depending on what kind of purchase order you have created, you do a GR directly against the stock or directly as a consumable, and you do an IR and settle the invoice. You see, you have to create, you have to do a GR, you have to settle the invoice, right? If you were to do it using the blanket purchase order, how would things be different? Well, you'd create a blanket BO and you would only do this once for, let's say, a month or 2 months or 2 weeks, depending on what kind of leeway you want to give for these products and the people ordering those products. If you trust the people very well, you could just say, hey, you know what, here is 20,000, that's it, deal with it. So you don't have to create the PO every time you're out of cups. You can just call the vendor and say, hey, I need 100 cups or 1,000 cups. And how is he going to deliver them? Through the same truck, but no goods receipt. He's going to give those cups directly to you. Just go use them. You don't have to receive them into the goods, blah, blah, blah. None of those steps. So you save a lot of time there. So you save time here by not having to create a PO every time. You save time here by not having to do a goods receipt and involve the warehouse folks. And the invoicing process stays the same. So the vendor does send an invoice and you could settle the invoice maybe in one go or maybe 2 invoices in one go. Right? So you save time here. You can even simplify the invoicing process, but that's something that we don't want to really bother about. That's for FI folks to do. The point being, you also save time here. And the blanket PO tells you how much you have consumed out of your total allocation of, say, 20,000 or 100,000. So the purpose of a blanket PO is to simplify the procurement of Class C material.